Picture this beneath the blazing sun of Egypt, armored knights, not Egyptian, not Muslim, but Christian, descend into a tunnel no local will approach. They wear the red cross of the Templars. But this isn't Jerusalem, it's Giza. And what they find there doesn't belong in any Crusader chronicle. Not relics, not bones. Something older, something impossible. What if the Knights Templar found something buried beneath the pyramids, something that didn't just reshape their secret rituals, but threatened the authority of the church itself? And what if the reason they were hunted down had nothing to do with gold? Take a breath. Let the heat fade from your skin. Let the tension soften like sand slipping through your fingers. The story you're about to hear isn't written in the official records. It's carved in stone, whispered in ruins, and half erased by time. But it waits just below the surface. The Templars are usually framed within the borders of the Holy Land Jerusalem and battles for sacred relics. But what happens when you follow their footsteps beyond that map into Egypt? Not as invaders, not as pilgrims, but as quiet seekers. Men who weren't just fighting for God, but looking for something older than Scripture. In this journey, we're not chasing the Ark or the Grail. We're descending into tunnels beneath the ancient stone colossi of Giza, into chambers no one recorded, into secrets guarded by silence, sand, and time. You'll hear of scrolls smuggled to Europe, rituals copied from walls lit by torchlight, an alchemy of cross and ankh. Tonight, we don't ask why the Templars fell, we ask what they found first. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. They weren't supposed to be there. When the Knights Templar first emerged in the aftermath of the First Crusade, their purpose was clear: protect Christian pilgrims, secure the roads, defend the Holy Land. Egypt, it was outside the mandate. Too far, too foreign, too politically entangled. And yet whispers from within Crusader chronicles and overlooked Arabic sources suggest that detachments of Templar knights moved quietly into Egyptian territory, far earlier and far more often than anyone admits. The standard narrative places them squarely within Jerusalem, Acre, and Antioch. But an unusual deviation begins to appear in logistics records around the mid-12th century. Supply caravans meant for Palestine inexplicably vanish off course, redirecting through the Nile Delta. Horses bred for desert combat are suddenly being transported across the Sinai. Templar symbols appear in port manifests at Damietta and Alexandria ports, supposedly off-limits, due to ongoing hostilities. And most tellingly, a handful of captured Templars during early skirmishes in Egypt seem to carry documents in Coptic, not Latin. Of course, official church histories dismiss these records as misattributions or battlefield confusion. But there's something too patterned, too consistent to ignore. Even Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and al-Makrizi make passing reference to white-cloaked Franks moving through Egyptian deserts, not in open conflict, but as guests. Or perhaps as students. Now let's be clear, Egypt was no Crusader playground. The Fatimid Caliphate and later Saladin's Ayyubid dynasty held firm control of the land. But political alliances in the 12th century were rarely about ideology. Power was the currency, and knowledge, especially hidden knowledge, could be traded just like gold. It's entirely plausible that certain Templar commanders, perhaps acting outside church oversight, entered into quiet arrangements with Egyptian officials or esoteric circles. And here's the wrinkle that keeps historians up at night. The Templars were obsessed with sacred geometry, mystical numerology, and hidden knowledge. And Egypt? Well, Egypt had that in spades. If you were a knight secretly seeking what the ancients knew, astronomy that rivaled Galileo medicine, that predated Hippocrates or rituals older than Genesis, you wouldn't go to Rome. You'd go to Cairo, quietly, and perhaps never come back the same. One particularly obscure clue comes from a 12th century Templar inventory list recovered near Tyre. It mentions between armor and incense a single line that simply reads, "Manuscript received from the black-robed one of Misr being the Arabic name for Egypt." No further explanation. Just that. A hint like a breadcrumb dropped into the silence. This raises a tantalizing question. What if the Templars' missions into Egypt weren't deviations, but the real objective? What if Jerusalem was just the cover story, and Egypt, the land of tombs and time, was the actual treasure hunt? It would make sense in a way. After all, the Church would never approve of knights learning from infidels, let alone mystics. So whatever they found there would have to stay buried either beneath sand or within secret rites passed quietly from night to night. And if even a fraction of those rites were shaped by ancient Egyptian knowledge, then the entire structure of Templar ritual from initiation to silence might owe as much to the Nile as to Nazareth. That silence, both from the knights themselves and from the church that later burned them, might be the strongest proof we have. Because men don't keep quiet unless the truth is too dangerous to speak, or too sacred to betray. One might argue that Egypt was never a detour. It was the destination, and what lies beneath its pyramids may have altered the Templars far more than any sword ever did. It began with an offhand mention, in a footnote, one of those dusty corners of archival research most historians skim past. A 13th century letter attributed to a Templar scribe stationed near Gaza, referring to a scroll of papyrus, inscribed with sacred diagrams, received from a Coptic intermediary near Al-Fustat. The letter itself, long believed to be a forgery, has re-emerged in recent decades thanks to digital preservation efforts. And suddenly, what once sounded like fiction now bristles with unsettling plausibility. The document, often referred to simply as the Cairo letter, is short, barely 3 paragraphs. But its contents point toward a clandestine exchange. A Templar officer named Hugo de Pontoise receives a bundle from the blind elder wrapped in linen marked with a peculiar symbol, a circle nested within a triangle which Templar symbology experts have tentatively connected to early initiatory diagrams. The blind elder, described as a keeper of the wells beneath the stones, demands no payment, only silence. What's more, the letter's phrasing includes references to those who predate the pharaohs and the House of the Horizon, a name strongly associated with the ancient temple of Akhetaten, built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, and known for its solar theology. That this terminology appears in a Latin letter written by a Knight of the Cross suggests that the Templars weren't merely collecting maps or relics, they were being drawn into a different cosmology entirely. Modern Egyptologists have long debated the extent to which ancient esoteric knowledge survived through Coptic transmission. While the mainstream view holds that the rise of Christianity erased the old ways, a growing minority believed that certain rites, prayers, and diagrams were quietly preserved, passed from priest to monk, repurposed into Christian metaphor, but never entirely lost. The Templars, operating in secret and always hungry for the mysteries of antiquity, would have been ideal recipients for such transmissions, especially if they promised spiritual power. Some have dismissed the letter as a clever fabrication, perhaps a literary invention, or a misinterpreted fragment of a trade agreement. But the physical characteristics of the document say otherwise. The ink composition, parchment texture, and stylistic Latin script all match 13th century standards. And then there's the watermark, a faint sigil only visible under ultraviolet light, matching the seal found on an ossuary unearthed near Giza in 1904. That ossuary oddly contained not bones but scorched scraps of papyrus. They were dismissed at the time as later additions, but that was before the Cairo letter resurfaced. Even more strangely, a marginal note on the back of the parchment written in Arabic script includes a warning. He who opens the vault will not survive the song. It's been interpreted as poetic flair, or a reference to acoustic traps known in certain tombs, resonant chambers designed to disorient intruders. Either way, it casts a long shadow over what the Templars might have opened. Recall that just one chapter ago we noted the Coptic language appearing on Templar field documents. This papyrus letter, then, is not an anomaly, it is part of a pattern. A thread stretching across battles and borders connecting knights to monks, pyramids to crosses. Perhaps the most chilling element is what Hugo doesn't say. The letter ends abruptly. No commentary, no exultation, no fear, just this: we will not write again. The light beneath the stone has changed us. Changed us. The phrasing alone is haunting. Not enlightened, not empowered, changed. And then silence. To this day, no further correspondence from Hugo de Pontoise has ever been found. It's as if the letter was not a beginning, but a final breath. So what did the Templars read on that papyrus? What diagram symbol or incantation was so profound it could erase a man's words? Some speculate the scroll mapped a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx. Others suggest it contained fragments of a pre-Mosaic cosmology, one that blended Egyptian solar worship with something far older. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't matter what was written. Maybe it mattered where the scroll came from. It's easy to think of the Templars as confined to the battlegrounds of the Holy Land swords, drawn standards, raised fortresses bristling with defenders. But every so often, a map betrays an oddity. A fortification where no crusade was declared. A structure too European for its surroundings. A glyph that doesn't quite match Islamic architecture or Coptic tradition. And Cairo, Old Cairo in particular, is littered with them if you know where to look. Beneath the modern traffic and bustling markets, the bones of Fustat, the medieval capital of Islamic Egypt, still whisper. Among its ruins lies an overlooked wall, a strange stone segment tucked behind the church of St. Sergius, bearing the faint outline of a cross, whose arms taper unnaturally. Its proportions match the croix pâtée, the iconic emblem of the Knights Templar. Locals have long considered it a Crusader artifact, perhaps a repurposed stone. But the real question isn't what it is, it's why it's there. Several structures in this older part of Cairo have floor plans inconsistent with Islamic design. There's the so-called Red House, a two-story ruin with narrow vertical arrow slits uncommon in Egyptian architecture, but nearly identical to those found in Templar holdings in Tripoli. Its basement, what remains of it, contains collapsed archways that descend into a vault, sealed with what some claim was a lead lining long since looted. Then there's the Tower of the Strangers, less a tower than a squat stone block, with no documented origin. Its name derives from an Ottoman-era poem that references foreign guardians who vanished with the sun. Excavations around it in the 1930s revealed tools not native to the region, a Western-style spade, fragments of chainmail, and a single rusted spur, Norman in design, dated to the early 1200s. Taken alone, each artifact could be chalked up to trade, repurposing, or coincidence. But when viewed together, and especially when mapped, they form a curious ring around an ancient necropolis thought to predate even the Islamic conquest. Right at the center, a derelict subterranean water channel, known as the Serdab Well, where, according to early 14th century Coptic records, men in white cloaks were once seen chanting in tongues foreign to the Nile. It is at this point that the line between architecture and ritual blurs. Several of these structures, particularly the Red House, contain geometric markings that correspond to solstitial angles, not unlike those found in Giza's pyramid complexes. One doorway sealed with brass studs aligns precisely with the setting sun on the summer solstice. Coincidence, possibly. But the Templars were not strangers to sacred geometry. Their cathedrals across Europe echo such alignments, often rooted in older pagan cosmologies. The question arises, what were they doing here? It's tempting to frame it as reconnaissance preparing for an incursion, but the evidence suggests otherwise. These were not outposts. They were observation points, stations of silence, places not of war, but of waiting. A lesser-known chronicle by Jean de Sancerre, a Templar imprisoned in Cairo after the Seventh Crusade, makes a passing remark about a circle of stones that speaks to the heavens hidden beyond the city of black domes. Scholars have long dismissed it as fevered metaphor. But paired with the map discovered in the possession of Hugo de Pontoise, the same knight whose last letter referenced the light beneath the stone, it paints a different picture. Not conquest. Pilgrimage. The Templars in this reading were tracing not the steps of Christ, but the arc of an older path, one hidden beneath layers of conquest, repurposed temples, and crumbling catacombs. And Cairo, sitting atop millennia of buried ritual, may have been their quietest, strangest waypoint. Of course, no one can say for certain. Most of these sites are now built over lost to urban expansion, or dismissed by official archaeology. But a few like the Red House still stand quiet, abandoned, and out of place. If you ever visit, look for the grooves in the stone. They don't match any local chisel. They spiral inward. Beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, sometimes stone speaks louder than scroll. Not far from the Giza Plateau, where the shadow of the Great Pyramid lingers long into twilight, there exists a chamber not marked on modern tourist guides, not roped off by security, not etched into official records. It lies half-collapsed beneath a colonial-era warehouse rediscovered in the 19th century, then quickly forgotten. They call it the Vaulted Map Chamber. It began with a letter. In 1851, British antiquarian Charles Halley wrote to his sponsor in London of a subterranean vault west of the Nile, brick-sealed, faintly carved, and curiously European. At the time, Egypt was a frenzy of digs and whispers, but what caught Halley's eye wasn't just the chamber's shape, it was what was drawn on its walls. Faded, faint, and scorched, from what looked like fire, the walls bore geometric lines and coastlines that did not match any known Egyptian map. But here's where it turns, a scrawled Latin phrase barely legible beneath a tangle of soot and erosion translated roughly to from the rock to the sands, the circle holds. Halley claimed the lettering was unmistakably medieval Latin and more specifically templated in the hand used by monastic scribes of the 12th century. The chamber's design, too, raised eyebrows. Barrel-vaulted ceiling, a corbel arch, wall recesses at shoulder height as if for storage or ritual placement. Not Egyptian, not Roman, something out of place. But it was the central pillar that changed everything. Halley described it as octagonal, unusual in that region, with a rust-colored stain on one face and a groove carved like a winding serpent. A brass inlay since removed or stolen was once embedded at its crown, and he swore that when polished, it caught even torchlight with eerie brilliance. Beneath the base, a stone tile bore the faint outline of a cross, but not any cross. This one flared at the ends, unmistakably, a Templar croix pâté. Skeptics at the time mocked the claim. They chalked it up to colonial delusion, a hunger for romantic fables in the wake of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. And when the chamber collapsed during a minor earthquake in 1864, burying the site, most were content to let it fade. But a curious document surfaced decades later, a copy of Halley's notes in the personal archive of a French Freemason named Étienne Laval. Laval's annotations suggest he knew of the chamber before Halley ever arrived. More intriguingly, he connected the map-like engravings on the walls to an apocryphal scroll referenced in Templar archives seized by the Inquisition. This scroll, he claimed, contained the old lay of the earth before the deluge, an echo of Atlantean myth encoded in symbols known only to the initiated. The implications, wild, yes, but impossible to fully dismiss. Because even now, architectural historians studying fragments of the vaulted map chamber's floor, salvaged and stored in a dusty basement in Marseille, have confirmed that the stone matches no known Egyptian quarry. Instead, it's limestone chemically consistent with deposits found in southern France. How such stone made its way to the outskirts of Cairo in the 1200s is a mystery wrapped in silence. And yet, there's another layer. An obscure passage in the travel records of Wilhelm von Schaffhausen, a German noble who passed through Egypt in 1224, mentions being shown a Christian crypt beneath the sands carved with maps that no priest could read. He claimed to have seen knights praying there, silent, cloaked, unmoving. No local dared enter with him. When pressed, his host said only, "The ones who built that place did not die in Egypt, but they left part of themselves behind." Coded language. A metaphor, perhaps, or perhaps it points to something more, something not built for the Templars, but by them. This raises a troubling possibility that the Templars did not merely visit Egypt, but constructed chambers beneath it. That they carved European architecture into Egyptian rock not as conquerors, but as preservers of something older. That the maps they etched weren't of the surface world, but of something buried. Caverns, vaults, hidden chambers. One could argue with a long enough breath and a dim enough torch that they weren't mapping the Egypt they stood on, but the Egypt that lay beneath. And perhaps that's why this particular chamber bore no record in local legend, no curse, no myth. Because it wasn't native. It was planted, an anomaly, a seed. A place left behind not to be found by Egyptians, but by someone else. Someone cloaked in red and white. Someone carrying not just the cross, but a memory they weren't supposed to have. In the haze of war and the dust of doctrine, some agreements are never written down. They hum beneath the surface like a secret heartbeat, known only to those who dare to listen. Saladin, the famed Sultan of Egypt and Syria, is remembered in glowing tones by both Muslim and Christian chroniclers, noble, brilliant, magnanimous in victory. But buried in that legend is a murkier tale, one that whispers of an agreement not between generals, but between shadows cloaked in white and crescent. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 broke the Crusader states like dry twigs. The kingdom of Jerusalem, once thought invincible, crumbled within months. Yet curiously, while Saladin's forces executed thousands of captured knights, one group was treated differently. Not all Templars met the sword. A handful, records suggest, were separated, escorted elsewhere, and vanished from any prison roll. Contemporary Muslim historians like Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad wrote of unusual negotiations preceding Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem. There were visits not to kings or patriarchs, but to cloisters, to abbots, to unnamed emissaries in armor without heraldry. One meeting held in a stone tower on the Nile Delta involved a Templar commander whose name does not appear in any Latin chronicle. All we have is a nickname, the one with two shadows. This same commander appears again in Islamic records this time, as being seen entering the mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, flanked not by guards, but by scholars. The implication is strange. A knight of Christ walking among imams and jurists discussing what "here's where the thread's knot." Saladin had recently secured access to a newly unearthed chamber near Giza. Egyptian workers had collapsed part of a structure while quarrying stone for a madrasa, exposing a stairwell that descended into the bedrock. Saladin, deeply invested in the esoteric sciences and sympathetic to the Fatimid obsession with ancient knowledge, personally ordered the chamber sealed from public view. It's believed he visited the site 3 times. What occurred next isn't clear, but within weeks of the chamber's sealing, those mysterious Templar negotiations intensified. Saladin then delayed his final assault on Tyre, curious given his strategic advantage, and one Templar contingent, previously presumed lost in the desert skirmishes, reappeared suddenly at Acre, travel-stained, silent, and burdened with covered carts that no scribe dared inventory. The question becomes, what did Saladin offer them? A theory heretical to many but tantalizing suggests this: Saladin granted the Templars access to the chamber, not out of weakness, but out of calculation. He understood what they were seeking, and he too was intrigued. Both sides, you see, worshipped a singular, all-seeing God. Both built their rites on disciplined secrecy ritual. And both perhaps had legends of a place beneath the pyramids where older truths lay, buried truths that neither Quran nor Bible ever touched. A proto-religion, some whisper, older than Moses, older than pharaohs, born not of man, but of stars and stone. If the Templars believed this, Saladin may have as well. And in return for access, the Templars may have offered something rarer than gold: silence. A pact that the chamber's contents would remain undisturbed, not stolen, not displayed, but remembered, transcribed, encoded within a select brotherhood that would guard the knowledge until the stars aligned once more. There is a tantalizing clue, a letter from the chronicler Ernul, a layman associated with the Templars, who claimed that the Sultan gave a gift not of coin nor land, but of depth. That phrase of depth has confounded translators. But in the context of this story, its meaning becomes clear. The gift was not treasure, it was entry. Now remember the map chamber, the strange European scripts in Cairo, the possibility of imported limestone. What if those things only came after this deal, after the Templars had been granted access and began building, recording, concealing? And then there's the curious case of an unfinished Templar fortress on the edge of the Nile Delta. Begun swiftly in 1189, abandoned just 2 years later. Its foundations suggest the layout of an underground archive rather than a garrison. The Templars never explained why they left it. Some say the river's course shifted. Others suggest they were told firmly to leave. By whom and why, the Templars' silence speaks volumes. Inquisition transcripts centuries later refer obliquely to the Southern Pact, a term scholars often mistake for a political treaty. But the phrase always appears in confessions involving Egypt, in dreams, in fevered recollections, in maddened drawings scrawled by monks who died in chains. The Southern Pact, a deal, a depth, a door. Was Saladin's greatness not just in arms or intellect, but in knowing when to let his enemies dig for him? He knew the Crusaders would eventually fall. But perhaps he also believed that some knowledge, especially that found in darkness, was too dangerous to deny outright. Let them carry it. Let them hide it. Let them become cursed by it. And maybe that's why, when the Templars were finally broken 2 centuries later, they died not screaming of heresies, but guarding a silence they had sworn in stone. You'd expect silence inside the Great Pyramid, stillness, air thick with millennia. What you don't expect is graffiti. Yet there it is carved where no visitor should ever have gone deep within the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Faint, angular scratches of red ochre and soot, some in Greek, some in Latin. One unmistakably in the shape of a cross flared at the ends, unmistakably Templar. The standard academic position is quick and dismissive quarry marks, they say. Left by Egyptian work crews, nothing more. But the problem is, these marks sit on finished stone, not raw blocks. They're in inaccessible places higher than a man could easily reach, and more importantly, some of them post-date the 12th century. The cross with the flared arms, for example, isn't just a Christian symbol. It bears specific stylistic traits used by the Templars during their late Crusader period. The ends are patis-flared in the traditional Templar fashion, with embellishments more typical of Western European iconography than ancient Egyptian. It was Colonel Howard Vyse, a 19th-century explorer and explosives enthusiast, who first forced his way into the upper chambers of the Great Pyramid using gunpowder. What he found was unexpected red inscriptions drawn hastily on the walls, and among them a set of foreign letters. He chalked them up to rogue masons or hoaxes, but he also destroyed several sections in his rush to excavate, and the original photographs, frustratingly, are lost. The only known sketches of these inscriptions were found much later in the personal journal of a forgotten surveyor named Carl Lepsius, a man known for embellishment, but also for a fascination with Templar lore. His marginal notes are cryptic. In one passage he refers to crosses not of Christ, but of Solomon, and in another marks which speak of the brotherhood in the hollow of stone. More intriguing still is a separate carving, this one found not in the Great Pyramid, but in the smaller pyramid of Menkaure. Near the subterranean chamber is a scratch almost like a signature that appears to blend two scripts, Latin and what might be Proto-Coptic. The translation is rough, but one phrase is consistently interpreted as "the light is beneath." That's not Egyptian. That's initiatory language. Mystery school phrasing. What were European hands doing carving into sacred spaces? Here's one hypothesis: they weren't desecrating. They were recording. Templars steeped in ritual and secrecy may have entered these chambers not as conquerors, but as initiates. Think of the graffiti not as vandalism, but as trail markers. Code left for others in their order. A whisper etched in stone saying, "We were here. We found it. Keep going." It's worth recalling that earlier during the investigation of the vaulted map chamber, we encountered claims of inscriptions in European hands deep underground. This is not a coincidence. A pattern is forming an echo of Western script in Eastern darkness, hinting at coordinated exploration, perhaps even a secret Templar rite of passage. A theory that gained traction in the early 20th century suggested that Templar scouts disguised as pilgrims or merchants paid their way into Egyptian ruins using gifts of silver and protection. In some cases, they may have entered with tacit permission from local mystic orders trading knowledge for silence. This brings us to an often overlooked Templar chronicle, written by Brother Matthias of Acre. In one dusty folio he describes tunnels that spoke in airless whispers, where stone bore the sign of both east and west. The phrasing is maddeningly poetic, but unmistakable in implication. He had been inside, or someone close to him had. What these signs point to is not just exploration, but documentation. The Templars may have been mapping a route, chronicling a passage through chambers meant to be sealed. But the true question lingers: what did they expect to find that was so dangerous? They needed to write on the walls to remind themselves it was real. Modern Egyptology rarely entertains these possibilities. Graffiti is graffiti, they insist. But the refusal to translate some of these symbols, the outright dismissal of Latin-based carvings as coincidence, feels increasingly tenuous. We're left with the uncomfortable possibility that beneath the very stones revered as the cradle of civilization, a parallel narrative exists. One not of pharaohs and gods, but of cloaked men with red crosses ducking through torch-lit corridors, scratching symbols into smooth walls as a breadcrumb trail for those who would come next. Even today, archaeologists working on remote parts of Giza's subterranean grid occasionally find Christian symbols in odd places. But they are catalogued, stored, forgotten. Because what would it mean if the Templars truly went that far if their graffiti lies not in castles or cathedrals, but in the heart of Egypt's oldest tombs? It would mean they weren't just crusaders. They were seekers, and someone or something wanted the message left behind. The road east from Giza leads you into the blinding sun. But if you keep following it past the crumbling ruins and the haze of dust, you arrive at Heliopolis, the city of the sun. At least that's what it was called in the time of the pharaohs. By the 12th century, when the Templars passed through Egypt, much of it had already vanished into sand and myth. But even ruins leave whispers, and the stories that remain are stranger than anything they expected to find. Heliopolis was sacred, older than Memphis, revered even by the Greeks and Romans. Its obelisks once stood like antennae to the gods, sacred to the cult of Ra and the priesthood of the sun. But beneath that sun worship lay another tradition far more obscure. A tradition that honored not the light, but the rhythm of shadow. The moon cult of Khonsu. Why were the Templars warriors of the cross trained in Rome and sworn to Jerusalem seen entering those ruins? A Coptic manuscript discovered in the monastery of St. Anthony describes strange visitors in white cloaks who appeared in Heliopolis, bearing gifts, asking no questions, speaking little. They were granted access to underground shrines that had long been sealed to outsiders. The text, penned by a monk known only as Kairos, claims that the visitors carried with them a Marian icon, an image of the Virgin Mary, and placed it beside a lunar altar. Then they watched and waited for moonlight. It sounds like nonsense, but the Coptic Church has long merged early Christian symbology with remnants of Egyptian ritual. Mary is often depicted in moonlight standing on crescents cloaked in stars. This iconography, marginal in Western Christianity, was central in Egyptian Christianity. To some monks, Mary and Isis weren't so different. What the Templars may have witnessed or participated in was a hybrid rite, a merging of the cross and the crescent moon, not as symbols of conflict, but of fusion. And that's not all. Etchings found in a ruined chamber near Heliopolis show something remarkable: a figure in Western mail armor, kneeling beside a priest in Egyptian robes. Between them stands an altar atop which is carved a symbol combining the cross and the lunar disk, perfectly interlocked, like a key within a keyhole. This discovery was dismissed by early Egyptologists as a Christian defacement. But under infrared imaging, the carving appears to predate the Crusades. In other words, it wasn't added, it was anticipated. So now the question becomes, were the Templars following a trail of their own making, or one already laid down for them? It wouldn't be the first time the order engaged in syncretic exploration. Back in Jerusalem, they were accused of blasphemy for collecting Islamic manuscripts and fraternizing with Sufis. But in Egypt, they went further. There are accounts of Templars attending Coptic vespers, lighting incense in lunar chapels, and asking peculiar questions about cycles, solar, lunar, even agricultural. And then there's the so-called Lunaria Codex, a burned manuscript found in the Templar commandery at Limassol. It contains an indecipherable calendar marked not by months, but by moon phases and solstice alignments. Its margins are filled with sketches of what appear to be Heliopolitan ruins. One phrase repeats, "The goddess sings to the stone when the moon is full." That's not knightly theology. That's esoteric ritual. And if you remember the earlier trail of graffiti beneath the pyramids, you'll recall one phrase etched in the hybrid Latin Coptic scrawl, "The light is beneath." Perhaps now we understand what kind of light they meant. Not sunlight, not divine light, but the silver-blue glow of the moon spilling across ancient altars in forgotten rites. There's a quiet theory barely whispered even among occult historians that the Templars weren't just looking for relics. They were looking for resonance, for sacred alignments, for energy. The kind of energy that only appears when certain conditions are met, place, time, symbol, intent. And in Heliopolis, the alignment between Christian Marian devotion and Egyptian lunar ritual may have provided such a convergence. It's not something they could bring back in a box, but it may have been something they recorded, something they swore to keep secret, something that shaped how they saw the cross, not just as a weapon or a burden, but as a key. And remember Nicholas Flamel. His notes on Egyptian rites always began with lunar references. No transformation, he wrote, without first the baptism of silver light. He never set foot in Egypt, but perhaps someone passed the ritual along. Perhaps it came from Heliopolis, written on parchment folded carefully in a Templar's satchel carried westward like a spark waiting to catch. Heliopolis is mostly gone now. Just dust and stones and a single obelisk standing lonely in a Cairo square. But the memory remains of a temple where the moon once touched the cross and where knights in silence might have knelt. You begin to hear the stories long before you reach the site. Whispers in souks, muttered prayers in back alleys, nods exchanged between silent old men with cataract eyes. Beneath the pyramids, they say, lies something older than the pharaohs, something not meant for the uninitiated. And more curiously still, they claim it has guardians. Not soldiers, not priests, but keepers of knowledge. Locals call them the White Shadows. Foreigners once called them madmen, but the Templars paid attention. In 1210, a Frankish chronicler named Guy de Valenciennes recorded an unusual account while embedded with a Templar detachment in Egypt. His diary fragmentary and half-burnt references an encounter outside Giza with a sect cloaked in dust, garbed as the ancient dead who claim dominion over the vault of the eye. At first glance, it reads like a hallucination. But then the details start to align. Multiple sources, Arabic, Coptic, even one Byzantine, describe a group of desert mystics living in the shadows of the pyramids. They wore linen wraps and bore staffs carved with both Christian crosses and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. They spoke of a vault deep beneath the sand that they alone were bound to guard. And when the Templars came, something strange happened. They didn't fight. They welcomed them. Now, this isn't the romanticized clash of civilizations history tends to serve us. It's something more awkward, more intimate. The Templars, armed and armored, were reportedly led into a series of shallow crypts behind the Sphinx. There, the locals performed a kind of initiatory rite involving sand drawings, oil lamps, and repetitive chants, invoking not just God, but the children of the sky flame. That's not Christian. That's something else. One recovered Templar letter, long buried in the Vatican archives and briefly published before being quietly retracted, described the event as a communion of tongues of stars and of time itself. The writer claimed that beneath the Sphinx, he saw a chamber untouched by water or time, whose ceiling glowed, though no fire burned. It sounds absurd until you recall the stories from Heliopolis, the moon rites, the blended iconography, the obsession with light that is not sunlight. But there's more. In 1821, an amateur archaeologist named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt wrote of finding a triangular alcove in Giza, its walls covered in carvings that looked vaguely Celtic. He didn't know what to make of it, but next to the alcove he found a broken amulet bearing the cross pate, unmistakably Templar. And then there's the tale of the three silent ones. According to an oral tradition preserved by Bedouin elders near Saqqara, three foreign men, pale-skinned and cloaked in white, were seen entering a hidden shaft behind a crumbling mastaba. They were led by locals who called them the ones who return. The strangers stayed underground for 7 nights. When they returned, they spoke not a word. They left the village mounted on camels and disappeared west toward Alexandria, then likely Acre. The villagers were paid in gold, but not coins, scales, weights, ancient-looking, stamped with what looked like Phoenician markings. So who were these guardians, and what did they show the Templars? One theory quietly circulated among esoteric circles is that these desert mystics were descendants of a priestly class that survived Egypt's collapse by going underground, literally. When the Library of Alexandria burned, they moved their secrets south. When the Roman Empire cracked, they hid beneath the sand. And when the Crusaders came, they watched from the shadows until they saw something familiar. A sigil, a gesture, a phrase, something that convinced them the Templars might be worthy of entry. It's not a popular theory. It's heresy according to Rome, but it keeps resurfacing, especially when you remember that the Templars were obsessed with geometry, sacred proportions, star alignments, all things the ancient Egyptian priests were masters of. Perhaps the guardians weren't protecting treasure. Perhaps they were protecting a kind of code, one that required the right initiates to unlock. And perhaps that code is what the Templars carried back with them. Not gold, not relics, but a fragment of something larger. A map not of territory, but of meaning. There's even a fresco in a chapel in southern France, barely preserved, showing 3 knights kneeling before a pyramid. Hovering above them is not a cross, but an eye surrounded by flame. The inscription beneath Lux Sub Arena, light beneath the sand. No one knows who painted it, but it was finished in 1253, right around the time the Templars disappeared from Egypt and began building strange, star-aligned chapels across Europe. So maybe the Guardians kept their oath. Maybe the Templars did too. And maybe, just maybe, the vault is still there untouched, beneath the pyramid, beneath history, beneath our understanding, waiting. You've probably heard the name Nicholas Flamel. Thanks to a certain boy wizard, he's now immortalized in pop culture as a benevolent alchemist with a philosopher's stone tucked neatly in his vest pocket. But behind the folklore, Flamel was very real and very mysterious. A 14th century Parisian scribe, he was modest middle class, and by all accounts unremarkable. Until something changed. According to both legend and suspicious financial records, Flamel became unexpectedly wealthy, founded charitable houses, and funded arcane inscriptions that hint at something far stranger than good luck. The story goes that he came into possession of a book, a very old book, one written not in Latin or Greek but in a language no scholar could place. And the twist, he claimed the book came from the East. For centuries, researchers dismissed this tale as myth, especially the part where Flamel allegedly traveled to Spain and then further toward lands once controlled by the Moors. But a set of marginal notes found in a crumbling manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale changed that. One note, barely legible, makes an unusual claim: the book came by knight's hand, who rode from the land of Horus bearing seal and shadow. That land of Horus is almost certainly a poetic reference to Egypt, and the seal scholars argue it refers to the cross pate of the Templars. Now pause there. If Flamel really did receive a book from Egypt, and if that book came via the Templars, or more precisely from something the Templars retrieved, then what exactly did they bring out of the desert? A clue lies in Flamel's own writings. In the allegorical images he had carved on his tomb, in the strange symbols etched above his doorway, and in the inscriptions surrounding the Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie church in Paris, financed partly by Flamel's wealth, we see patterns. Serpents coiled around staffs, suns flanked by eyes, pyramidal shapes topped with radiant discs, Egyptian motifs disguised beneath alchemical euphemism. Modern Flamel enthusiasts usually focus on the philosopher's stone, the legendary alchemical substance said to transform base metals into gold and grant eternal life. But in Flamel's descriptions, the stone is never purely a material object. It's always connected to illumination, the voice of the flame, and the eye, which sees past the veil. Phrases unnervingly similar to what Templar records say they witnessed beneath Giza. One specific image, known as the hieroglyphic figures, shows a kneeling man receiving a book from a figure robed in light. Behind the giver is a temple, its spires curved in the old Egyptian style. The figure bears no face, only a glowing disc. On the spine of the book is a sigil, two overlapping keys, beneath which is a tiny Templar cross. Flamel never explained the image. He died publicly, at least in 1418, but legends persist that he faked his death, vanishing into the east, perhaps returning what was never his to keep. Even his grave was later found empty. So what could have been in that book? Some say it was a transcription of a much older text, a scroll taken from beneath the pyramids, possibly stored within the Serapeum, or even the Library of Alexandria's scattered remains. A scroll not meant for Christian eyes. Its contents, according to whispered accounts, combined Egyptian funerary rites with something else, an early proto-Gnostic gospel linking resurrection, not to divine judgment, but to the transformation of internal light. Sound strange, it should. The Templars were accused of heresy in part because of their secret rituals, which allegedly included the denial of the crucifixion, the veneration of a bearded head, and rites involving spiritual transmutation. But what if these weren't heresies born from rebellion, but transmissions of knowledge older than Christianity itself? Knowledge buried in Egypt. Knowledge found by knights who dug where they were told not to dig. A recurring motif in both Templar and Flamel-related symbology is the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. This symbol of eternal return appears alongside diagrams of star alignments and pyramids. In a rare Templar carving discovered near Tomar, Portugal, the Ouroboros encircles a stone tablet, etched with unfamiliar glyphs. Glyphs that match those in the Flamel book, according to researchers who examined a lost facsimile made in 1891. That book has since vanished. The facsimile burned in a museum fire in 1943. Of course it was. But just as striking is how often Flamel's works reference themes found in Egyptian alchemy called chemia, from which the word alchemy itself derives. He writes of separating the light from the dark, of purifying the inner vessel, and awakening the eye within. These are not casual metaphors. They echo inscriptions found in tombs around Saqqara. They echo the rituals conducted by desert guardians in white. They echo the chant sung in the darkness beneath the Serapeum, according to that crusader's account, from ash to gold, from dust to flame, the eye remembers. What did the Templars find in Egypt? Perhaps not treasure, not in the way the Church imagined. But maybe they found a legacy. One passed from priests to mystics to scribes. One meant to remain buried, until a man with questions and time began to listen. You've already met the guardians. Now you've met the scribe, and between them perhaps lies the truth. Long before the Templars ever glimpsed the golden light of Egypt's desert, a different thread of Christianity had taken root in the Nile's shadow. The Copts, descendants of Egypt's earliest Christian communities, had carved out their own spiritual lineage, one deeply infused with the land's older echoes. They preserved not just scripture, but memory. Memory in stone churches built from temple ruins. Memory in liturgies sung in ancient tongues. Memory in rituals that felt oddly Egyptian, even to outsiders. When the Templars arrived in Egypt, they were not just crossing into enemy territory, they were stepping into a spiritual palimpsest. And standing quietly at its center were the Copts. Often overlooked in Crusader chronicles, they were neither Muslim nor Roman Catholic. They were something in between. And yet, according to the scribbled margins of a 1292 Templar travelogue attributed to Brother Emmerich of Beaujeu, it was the Copts who acted as translators' guides and in at least one case initiators. Emmerich's surviving pages are fragmentary, but one entry stands out. It recounts a meeting in the outskirts of what is now Al-Fustat, where the Templars were brought into a Coptic shrine built atop a pre-Christian ruin. The scribe describes a moment of silence followed by a Coptic elder presenting the knights with an object wrapped in linen covered in reeds and warm as if from the womb of earth. That object was never identified, but what followed a ritual involving sacred oil readings from a scroll written in Greek and references to the breath that passes between the two lands suggests a deliberate transmission, not of politics, not of treasure, but of wisdom. It's here we stumble upon an obscure and highly contested account in a Jesuit record from the 17th century. Buried in the Vatican archives, it tells of a monk named Theophilus who accused the early Copts of smuggling heretical material to the West texts that merged Christian gospels with pagan cosmologies. The Vatican response: swift denial. The Coptic Patriarchate silence. But modern Coptic historians speak of another truth. During the Crusades, Egypt's Christian communities were under pressure from Muslims who distrusted their allegiance, and from Catholics who saw them as theological liabilities. For the Copts, survival often meant secrecy, but it also meant selective alliances, and the Templars, with their strange rituals, independence from Rome, and hunger for knowledge, were ideal candidates. So what were the Copts guiding them towards? Consider the location of many early Coptic monasteries. A surprising number are built near ancient sites, Saqqara Abydos, the ruins of Akhmim. These weren't accidents of geography. These were pilgrimages of inheritance. The Copts believed that wisdom didn't die, it was transfigured. Some of their oldest hymns refer to Ra the sleeper and Isis the veil, using the names of Egyptian gods, not as idols but as metaphors for divine mystery. They didn't worship Horus, but they did know his myths, and they folded them with quiet care into their understanding of Christ. When the Templars arrived, they asked questions that others didn't, not about conquest, not even about conversion, but about light rebirth and the architecture of the soul. And the Copts answered. Not with sermons, but with stories. There's a folktale still told in some Coptic circles about the knights who came from the Red Cross. In it, these travelers are led beneath a ruined temple by a one-eyed monk. They enter a chamber carved in spirals filled with the scent of myrrh. There they're shown a box no larger than a book within which lies a stone etched with 3 overlapping symbols, a fish, an eye, and the Ankh. The monk says nothing. The knights weep. Then they leave, never to return. Folktale, yes. But remember, the Ankh appears in 2 rare Templar carvings recovered in Cyprus, and the fish and eye motif turns up in the margin of a codex once owned by Hugo de Payens. Coincidence, possibly. Unless you believe that these weren't just cultural borrowings, but spiritual transmissions, The Copts, after all, had kept older knowledge alive not in opposition to Christianity, but as its prelude. They believed Egypt was not just a land of tombs, but a land of waiting. And when the Templars arrived, perhaps they saw more than soldiers. Perhaps they saw inheritors. And the Knights, maybe they saw for the first time a version of faith that stretched not 2,000 years into the past, but 5. A Christianity not built atop ruins, but arising from them. Later in life, some senior Templars were said to enter silent devotion after returning from the East. They spoke less, fasted more, and wrote cryptic meditations on the desert's fire and the breath that binds the clay. Strange phrasing unless you know the Coptic term for soul, nephesh, or that the early desert fathers believed divine wisdom came through silence and sand. It's easy to dismiss the Coptic link as a side note, a colorful background to the Crusades' louder clashes. But for those chasing the roots of the Templar mystery in Egypt, the Copts aren't a footnote. They're a bridge. Beneath the desert floor outside ancient Saqqara, where sand hushes even the breath of time, lies one of Egypt's most enigmatic ruins, the Serapeum. It is a subterranean complex built to house the massive granite sarcophagi of the Apis bull's sacred beasts once believed to be vessels of divine power. Most visitors stand before the structure in awe of its scale, but for the Templars, according to a little-known Crusader chronicle, it may have been the setting for one of their strangest and most unsettling experiences. The chronicle in question, preserved only in a single Latin manuscript, attributed to a lesser-known knight named Sir Roland de Rieux, claims that a Templar unit accompanied by a Coptic guide was led into the Serapeum late one afternoon in 1226. The account is brief and filled with the sort of flourishes you'd expect from a man trying to sound braver than he felt, but tucked between its dramatic pauses is something curious. Roland writes not of tombs, but of resonance. He describes entering a vaulted corridor lit by oil lamps placed by unseen hands, hearing sounds that seemed to rise from the walls themselves, tones that shimmered like voices without words. One knight, overcome by the sensation, reportedly collapsed in tears. Another claimed the stones were humming prayers. Now this might sound like a poet's exaggeration, but modern researchers have long noted the acoustic anomalies in the Serapeum. The ceilings and polished sarcophagi resonate at particular frequencies, chant or speak in certain tones, and the granite chambers return the sound with haunting precision. Some Egyptologists have even theorized that sound played a role in ritual, though most stop short of assigning it mystical weight. Not all do, though. In 1881, French archaeologist Gaston Maspero documented a local legend that foreign priests in white cloaks once descended into the Serapeum and performed a rite involving what villagers called machines that sing. These machines, never seen again, were said to make the stones come alive, vibrating in rhythm with the men's words. Maspero dismissed it as folklore, but the parallels with Roland's account are hard to ignore. More intriguing still is the inscription noted by the knight near the final chamber, a Latin phrase etched into the side of one sarcophagus. He transcribed it as vocem pedimus non mortuos, we seek a voice, not the dead. Scholars have debated whether this was a medieval addition or a misreading of an Egyptian original, but either way, it reveals something important. The Templars weren't just exploring tombs, they were listening. This moment marks a subtle but profound shift in the investigation. Until now, the narrative has focused on relics, texts, and symbols, objects of faith and power. But in the Serapeum, we find something different. A search for sound, for resonance, for a vibration that touches both matter and spirit. And this aligns uncannily with certain strands of Templar mysticism. Consider the order's unusual silence on many of their rituals. Unlike monastic orders of the same period, the Templars left behind few liturgical records. Some believe this was a security measure. Others argue it points to a form of spiritual practice that was never meant to be written down, perhaps one centered not on word, but tone, resonance, vibration. The kind one might learn beneath the ground in chambers built for gods older than memory. There's another thread worth tugging here. In 1904, a young British explorer named Alfred Ryder visited the Serapeum and claimed to find markings on a sealed door far beyond the tourist-accessible paths. He described these as Nordic runes intertwined with Egyptian sun disks. His notes were ridiculed, and the door in question has never been confirmed. But one symbol, he drew a combination of a cross and a serpent loop, bears a striking resemblance to a design found on a Templar reliquary recovered in Provence. Are these just symbols being recycled by different cultures, as some argue, possibly? Or do they point to a shared understanding passed from Egyptian priests to Coptic monks, and from them to the Templars, a line of wisdom not written in books, but sung in stone? It's worth recalling the strange silence that followed this particular Templar expedition. Roland's account ends abruptly after the Serapeum entry. No further pages exist, and none of the knights named are mentioned in any later records. No battles, no deaths, no burials, just quiet, as though they vanished or perhaps returned with something they were never permitted to speak of again. And yet in the centuries that followed, whispers of machines that sing appeared in Templar lore. A 14th-century poem, written by a French scribe known only as Alain of the Black Door, describes a voice of the sunstone bound in chambers under the lion god. The image is obscure, unless you've walked through Saqqara, where lion motifs appear in faded murals and granite still hums, if you dare to sing to it. Looking back this moment, the Serapeum encounter feels less like an isolated episode and more like a fulcrum. A pivot point between the Templars as soldiers and the Templars as seekers of something far stranger than the Holy Grail. They came looking for relics, but maybe what they found was vibration. Sound as a carrier of memory. Stone that remembers the voice of its maker. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the Templars tried to replicate back in Europe in chapel acoustics, enchanting rituals in the buried design of fortresses that still echo in strange harmony when the wind hits just right. Or maybe they simply listened, and in that resonance heard something not dead, not forgotten, just waiting. If you trace a crusader's finger across the old maps of Egypt, it rarely lands on Alexandria. Yet in the later decades of the Templar campaigns, something quietly shifted. Records begin to show more travel, more extended stays, and more whispered transactions in this storied coastal city, long past its glory days, long after its famous beacon had crumbled into the sea. And that raises a single aching question. What were they looking for? The official histories say the Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed centuries before the Templars arrived. Fires, war, religious fanaticism, pick your poison. But no one agrees on when or how it vanished. Some say Julius Caesar lit the spark, others blame Christian mobs or Arab conquerors. What's odd is how many times history insists on its destruction, as though repeating the obituary could bury the memory. Yet local legend in medieval Alexandria stubbornly persisted. The scrolls the scholars claimed were never entirely lost. Some had been moved, hidden, squirreled away in the catacombs beneath the city, or carried east to desert temples, or even sealed in subterranean chambers beneath the Serapeum. Yes, again, that name. It keeps echoing like a buried bell. In 1247, a Venetian trader named Marcellus di Gaeta recorded an encounter with two European knights in Alexandria who paid him for access to local scribes. They were described as wearing white mantles and bearing a red cross, almost certainly Templars. They didn't ask about spices or ports. They asked for maps, not of cities, but of tunnels, ancient vaults, dead libraries. What happened next is even stranger. Months later, a new Templar commandery was quietly established, not far from Alexandria's crumbling Roman walls. Not fortified, not visible from the sea. Just a squat building constructed atop what had once been part of the city's scholarly district. Its foundations, according to a Coptic account, found in the monastery of St. Macarius, were laid over a vault of forgotten gods. Templar interest in Alexandria wasn't casual. It was methodical. A recovered scroll from a later French Inquisition, yes, the kind that came after the order fell, mentions a confiscated Templar ledger containing phrases like Chamber of Papyrus North and Keys of the Watcher's Mouth. These fragments make little sense until you consider Egyptian architectural slang. The mouth was often a symbolic entrance to an underworld archive, and Watcher might not refer to a person at all, but to a god Thoth, perhaps, or Horus in his all-seeing form. Of course, this is where the skeptics jump in. They argue that the idea of Templars recovering anything from the library is fantasy, that by the 13th century any remnants were long gone, but counter-arguments arise from a curious development in 1252, a dramatic shift in Templar scholarship. That year, internal records show a surge in the production of codices and illuminated manuscripts in France and Portugal. Many feature themes not typically associated with Christian texts, depictions of stellar alignments, geometries matching ancient Egyptian temple layouts, and even iconography resembling the syncretic gods of Hellenistic Egypt, Serapis, for one. One French volume now housed in the Bodleian Library includes a drawing of a tower half submerged in waves with scrolls swirling in the tide below. On its roof stands a knight hand outstretched to a falcon-headed figure. The caption reads, "He speaks through fire, not tongue." The implications are tantalizing. Could the Templars have recovered fragments literal or philosophical of Alexandrian knowledge? If so, what did they do with it? They weren't scribes. They were warriors. But perhaps that was the point. Guardians of something dangerous. Something incendiary. Now recall something mentioned earlier, the peculiar acoustic properties of the Serapeum. Some theorists believe that sound played a key role in the storage and transmission of knowledge in ancient Egypt. Not just spoken word, but resonant frequencies, chants, vibrations encoded in stone chambers. If the Templars had access to texts that described not only what knowledge to seek, but how to receive it through tone alignment, even ritual, then their presence in Alexandria begins to make sense. The city wasn't a destination. It was a key. And then there's the matter of the fortress. After the fall of Acre, survivors fled to Cyprus and beyond. But one lesser-known group reportedly returned to Egypt. A 14th-century Genoese chronicle notes a white order of knights seen rebuilding a citadel of stone and silence near the old Alexandrian quarter. No such structure exists today. Yet in 1932, during sewer construction, workers uncovered an underground corridor lined with collapsed arches and scorched pottery. Among the debris, a bronze amulet bearing both a Templar cross and an Egyptian was scepter. Coincidence, misidentification, perhaps, but maybe not. Maybe the Templars didn't just find scrolls beneath Alexandria. Maybe they reburied them. Imagine it an order of warriors turned curators quietly hiding the last remnants of the world's most famous lost library beneath a structure so nondescript that even time would forget it. Not out of greed, but necessity. Because some knowledge is too volatile for an age unready to receive it. The Templars were called heretics, but if they had discovered the mechanisms of the old world rituals of soul-weighting starlight navigation, sound-triggered memory, how could they have spoken plainly? Their silence may have been less about secrecy and more about reverence or fear. And if those scrolls still lie beneath the dust of Alexandria, well, they're not likely to surface now. Not with modern buildings, roads, and bureaucracies choking the ground above. But somewhere in the city's forgotten corners, a stone still hums. And maybe beneath it, parchment still sleeps. Maps lie. Or perhaps they only tell the truths we're ready to see. In the mid-13th century, a peculiar artifact began appearing in whispers across select Templar circles, never publicly acknowledged, never inventoried, and never, it seems, intended for the scrutiny of church officials. It was described not as a chart of lands, but as a map of depths, not of rivers or roads, but of vaults beneath the Giza plateau. Its provenance unknown, its language part Latin, part Demotic script, with occasional glyphs unmistakably Egyptian. But its implications, that's where things become irreversibly strange. The story begins not in Egypt, but in Acre, where a French-born Templar knight named Brother Emmerich returned from an unsanctioned journey south with a bundle of documents wrapped in wax-treated linen. He had been absent for nearly 4 months, far longer than permitted, and bore sunburnt skin, trembling hands, and a noticeable reluctance to speak of what he'd seen. When questioned, he offered only this: the sands remember. Among his possessions was the map. It was hand-drawn, but far too detailed to be speculative. It depicted a subterranean complex beneath the pyramids, complete with chambers, stairwells, ventilation shafts, and a long, winding corridor that terminated beneath what we now call the Sphinx. But what made this map so unusual wasn't the layout, it was the annotations. Along one shaft was scrawled the phrase Via Solis, the sun path. Another chamber bore the words Vox Caeli, voice of heaven. And above the largest vault, this chilling inscription, Tacet Sacramentum, the sacrament is silent. Most historians dismiss this map as a hoax or a misunderstood architectural sketch. But what they cannot easily explain is the convergence of multiple independent reports from different Templar holdings describing something remarkably similar. A scribe in Lisbon referred to the burial below breath. A commander in Provence sketched a symbol that matched the central chamber of Emmerich's map with eerie precision. A Templar codex recovered in the Vatican archives described a journey through the star-locked corridors where the lion waits. All these accounts circle back to one unsettling possibility: the Templars had either discovered or been given access to an ancient blueprint of Giza's hidden architecture. And that changes everything. If true, it would imply that knowledge of the inner workings of the pyramid's knowledge thought, lost since the Old Kingdom, survived in secret. Worse, it suggests that someone centuries after the pharaohs still knew how to interpret it. This would also explain certain Templar behaviors that until now seem oddly out of place. The peculiar focus on geometric symbolism in their commandery chapels, the cryptic references to inner light and sun rites in surviving initiation texts, and most of all, their obsession with protecting what they referred to as the sanctum of reversal, a phrase that puzzled scholars for centuries. But what if the reversal they spoke of wasn't metaphorical? What if the map marked a site not just of burial, but of transformation? Egyptian rituals, especially in their later Hellenized phases, spoke often of reversing death, of guiding the soul backward through time and space toward an original divine state. The Templars, having come from a world dominated by sin and salvation, may have found in this an entirely different kind of redemption, one not dependent on faith, but on geometry, light, and silence. And there's more. In 1264, a ship carrying relics and documents from the Levant to Marseille sank off the coast of Cyprus. Among the salvaged contents was a partially water-damaged scroll showing a layered cross-section of the Giza Plateau. Experts dismissed it as a 17th-century forgery until the ink was tested. It predated European printing by over 200 years. Some of the coordinates on that scroll correspond precisely with ground-penetrating radar data gathered by modern teams in the 1990s. Hollow cavities, long linear tunnels, a rectangular void beneath the paws of the Sphinx, once thought to be natural, now known to be geometric. How did the Templars know? One theory posits that they encountered an Egyptian sect, descendants of priests, perhaps who preserved this knowledge orally. Another suggests they recovered it from Alexandrian archives, or even the Serapeum as previously discussed. But the most radical theory claims they never discovered the map, because it was given to them. By whom, that's where the trail thins to vapor. Still, the ripple effects are clear. Within a decade of the map's appearance, Templar engineering across Europe began to shift. Spiral staircases reversed direction. Window placements in chapels began aligning with equinoxes, and certain fortresses, most notably Tomar in Portugal, were constructed with subterranean vaults mimicking the map's geometry. It's easy to scoff at such correlations. But pause for a moment and consider the cumulative weight. Dozens of references, artifacts, construction patterns, personal accounts from knights who claimed to dream of descending the lion's throat. At some point, coincidence becomes chorus. Perhaps the most haunting echo comes from a late Templar confession given under duress in Chinon. The knight anonymous in the record spoke of a place beneath stone teeth where the air does not move, and yet one hears the singing of light. He then added, "We were not the first, and we were warned not to be the last." That line has lingered for centuries. Maps do lie, but maybe only when they are misread. Or perhaps this map, the one that changed everything, was never meant to be read at all, but experienced. As a rite, as a passage, as a test. If the Templars passed it, they never told. But the silence, as always, says more than enough. You don't need to believe in divine bloodlines to understand their power. Just look at how many wars, marriages, and betrayals have unfolded in the name of blood, sacred or otherwise. Now take that idea, bury it in the sand for a few thousand years, wrap it in the silk of mystery, and you arrive at the quiet storm that is the bloodline theory in Egypt. Not just any bloodline, of course. This one traces from Christ, through the Merovingians, to a hidden heir smuggled beneath the shadows of pyramids. Yes, we're going there. While the Merovingian theory typically spirals out in France with whispers of Rennes-le-Château cryptic parchments, and Mary Magdalene, there's a lesser-known vein that runs directly into Egypt. Some say it was a strategic detour. Others call it a spiritual pilgrimage. But a handful of surviving accounts, dismissed by mainstream historians as apocryphal or imagined, tell of a Templar mission to escort a noble child of supposed sacred descent into Egypt, a place they believed could protect what Europe never could. At the heart of this story is a figure known only as the Pale Prince. His name appears in no official Templar record, but fragments of letters attributed to a Templar commander stationed in Damietta refer to a boy marked by the sign of the twin suns and the bloodline that echoes back to the Nazarene. These phrases aren't subtle, and they're not the kind of language used lightly, especially by men who wore the cross for a living. The theory claims the child was taken deep into Egypt sometime around 1210, not long after a failed crusade, and during a period when Templar influence in the region was unusually pronounced. Accompanied by knights sworn to a vow of silence, The Pale Prince was allegedly hidden among Coptic Christian communities, sheltered under the guise of pilgrimage, and eventually brought to a village near Saqqara home, to one of Egypt's most ancient burial grounds. There's an odd convergence of details here. Saqqara is not just ancient, it's layered, riddled with tombs that predate the pyramids themselves. If someone wanted to disappear into the folds of time, this would be the place to do it. Even more intriguingly, oral traditions from that area recorded in the late 1800s refer to the Child of the Cross, and the key said to have brought both light and danger to the region. Some tales speak of foreign knights with pale cloaks and unfamiliar tongues guarding a particular tomb for nearly a decade before vanishing. To make things even stranger, a local chronicle preserved in Coptic script, known as the Book of the South Gate, describes a visitor who carried the blessing of resurrection in his veins and was kept beneath the lion who drinks the sun. While poetic, this language bears eerie thematic resemblance to descriptions found in Templar initiation oaths that reference lions' resurrection and solar cycles. Naturally, critics have long dismissed these connections as coincidental or wishful thinking. But there's a reason the theory persists, not because of proof, but because of patterns. Patterns that loop back to earlier discoveries we've already touched on. The obsession with blood-solar alignment secrecy and the concept of divine resurrection. They're not isolated motifs, they're a lexicon. A language spoken only by those who believed they were safeguarding something or someone who could rewrite the script of salvation. There's also the architectural curiosity in Tamar, Portugal. Inside the Convent of Christ lies an octagonal chapel believed to be modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But above the entrance arch is a barely visible relief, eroded, but unmistakably showing a boy holding what appears to be both a cross and an ankh, a hybrid symbol, a bridge between Christ and Osiris, Templar and Pharaoh, life and resurrection. Some historians claim this is simply a medieval flourish. Others suspect it commemorates a boy who once carried the hopes of two civilizations. And then there's the riddle of the missing Templar records. Between 1208 and 1216, a conspicuous gap appears in several regional logs. Entire patrols supply movements, and encoded messages disappear from the timeline. What happened during these years? Why the blackout? Was it war weather, poor archiving, or deliberate erasure? We may never know. But the timing aligns disturbingly well with the supposed smuggling of the Pale Prince. It's easy to scoff at the idea of bloodlines. Most are fabrications meant to elevate fragile egos. But the Templars weren't just chasing gold or glory. They were building a mystery. And part of that construction may have included safeguarding a person real or symbolic, whose very existence threatened to overturn the Church's power structure. Because if a true heir to a divine bloodline existed, protected by Egypt's oldest secrets, then nothing the Church built was safe. So we're left with fragments, stories of a boy, crossed symbols in sandstone, whispers of the lion who drinks the sun, and a secret lineage buried not just beneath the pyramids, but beneath the narrative we've been told for centuries. The Pale Prince, the twin sons, the unrecorded journey. Coincidence or continuity carefully hidden in the one place no one dared to look. The Sphinx has stared silently into the desert for over 400 or 500 years. Most pass by it, marvel at its broken nose, snap a few photos, and move on. But what if it's not just a sculpture? What if it's a lock guarding a door that the Templars once opened? Modern archaeology often likes to scoff at ancient mystery hunters. But in this case, even the skeptics shift uncomfortably. Because beneath the massive paws of the Sphinx, radar scans have revealed something strange. Anomalies, chambers, voids, whatever term you prefer, they exist. And they've been the subject of both scientific caution and whispered obsession. One particular anomaly, shaped almost like a rough rectangle beneath the creature's right paw, has attracted the most attention. Some call it a tomb. Others think it might be an ancient record chamber. But among certain circles, especially those versed in Templar lore, it's known simply as the Door. To understand why the Templars might have sought this door, you have to return to a peculiar string of travel logs written by a lesser-known knight named Geoffroy de Vichy. His journals, rediscovered in a monastery near Toulouse in the 1700s, describe an encounter with the stone beast of Egypt, and an entrance that opened not with tools, but with light and verse. While many dismissed this as metaphor or madness, those familiar with ancient Egyptian religious practices saw something deeper. The phrase, "opened with light and verse," eerily aligns with the Egyptian opening of the mouth ritual, a ceremony believed to awaken divine statues or mummies using incantation and sunlight. And what if the Templars, guided by local mystics or Coptic intermediaries, discovered a way to adapt that rite not to awaken the dead, but to access what the dead had guarded? In the 19th century, before Egyptology became formalized, a British diplomat named Edward Montrose claimed to have found crude Latin carvings near the Sphinx's foundation. Though quickly dismissed by scholars as graffiti from Napoleonic soldiers, his sketches, now housed in a dusty archive in Cambridge, show something more peculiar: a cross within a circle flanked by what appears to be an ankh and a sword. This trifecta isn't common in any known European symbology, but bears striking resemblance to composite Templar Egyptian motifs already seen in other anomalous artifacts. Then there's the case of the sealed shaft. In the early 1900s, famed engineer Selim Hassan led one of the most detailed excavations around the Sphinx. His notes mention a suspiciously uniform crack on the northern side of the monument, just wide enough for a human to slip through if one were determined. Hassan dismissed it as erosion, but there's no record of what lay beyond. The shaft was resealed, quietly. The whispers suggest the Templars found that same passage centuries earlier. Guided by desert hermits who worshipped Horus in secret, they allegedly entered beneath the Sphinx in search of tablets said to predate both Moses and the pharaohs. Tablets not made of clay, but of something harder, stone fused with metal impervious to time. Of course, this sounds absurd, sci-fi masquerading as scholarship. But pause for a moment. Remember Nicolas Flamel and his supposed transformation. Recall the solar rituals, the obsession with death, rebirth, and light. Could it be that the Templars were chasing not treasure but resurrection itself, a secret encoded into Egypt's stone skeletons? One tantalizing clue emerges from a damaged fresco in Tamar, Portugal. Unlike the typical battle scenes, this one shows knights gathered not around a castle or cross, but a lion-headed statue partially buried in sand. One holds a torch. Another kneels beside what appears to be an open hatch. A beam of golden light pours from the opening, and within it something faintly shaped like a scroll or a body. We can't verify the painting's origin. It's unsigned, unreferenced, and displayed in a wing not open to the public. But those who've seen it whisper the same thought: it's the Sphinx. Not as it is today, but as it might have been when the Templars came. And that brings us to the strangest rumor of all: that before the fall of Acre, as Templar outposts crumbled and records were torched, a single page was sent west, carried by a rider who never gave his name, addressed to no known Grand Master, and hidden in a monastery where no Templar crest adorned the door. The page was said to contain a single drawing, a lion's head, a door beneath it, and beneath the door, stars. If that drawing ever existed, it's lost now. But the idea of a forgotten entrance, a celestial tomb, a chamber that only the initiated could unlock, persists. It may be fantasy, or it may be the key to why the Templars went to Egypt in the first place, not to convert, not to conquer, but to listen to the silence beneath the sand. Because something was speaking there, and maybe, just maybe, they understood it. The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. It buries them beneath layers of silent stone and time. But sometimes wind and fate conspire to reveal fragments, words etched into fading parchment, verses too dangerous to recite. And in the sands near ancient Memphis, the Templars may have unearthed something that neither church nor caliphate dared preserve: a gospel. Not just any gospel, not a canonical text or known apocrypha, but one that stitched together the teachings of Christ with the sacred geometry of Egypt, blending cross and Ankh resurrection and rebirth logos and Ka. A manuscript that, if it ever existed, would have rewritten the spiritual map of the Templars forever. The story begins with a cryptic letter dated 1226 discovered in a sealed compartment of a Maltese abbey. The handwriting is rough Latin, but with unusual flourishes, loops, and diacritical marks more common in Coptic script. The letter speaks of a hymn in the sand, a voice not born of Rome, and a warning: the papyrus burns the eye that reads too deeply. Most dismissed it as metaphor or madness, but buried in the same archive, half erased in soot and salt, is a map crudely inked, more like a sketch than a cartographer's work. It shows the ruins of Memphis south of Cairo, and a small crescent-shaped ridge marked only by two characters, XP. Some think it was shorthand for Christos. Others think it meant nothing, unless you were trained to see. Fast forward to a little-known Templar expedition, led by Hugues de Blanchefort, cousin to the better-known Bertrand. While Hugues' campaigns in the Levant are well documented, a 6-month gap appears in 1227. Records show he left Jerusalem with 20 men and returned with 6. No explanation, no surviving account. Only the rumors of time spent in the city of the old gods and of a book that sang under sunlight. Here's where things turn oddly concrete. In 1883, German archaeologist Ernst Wessler uncovered a buried room near the necropolis of Saqqara, not far from the ridge in the old map. Inside were charred wooden beams, ancient Christian graffiti, and a few scorched papyrus fragments preserved in sealed clay jars. One of the fragments bore a peculiar phrase in Greek: "He who breathes twice shall see the kingdom in both directions." No known gospel includes that line. No church text references breathing twice. But Egyptian funerary literature does. The Book of the Dead speaks often of dual breath, the breath of life and the breath of passage. Could the author of this gospel have been fusing Egyptian soul doctrine with early Christian mysticism? And more importantly, could the Templars have found a complete version centuries earlier? A former Jesuit scholar, Father Antonio Vecchi, claimed in 1922 that the Vatican once housed a sealed sermon of the twins, attributed to a manuscript found in Egypt and translated by Templar monks. Vecchi's writings were suppressed, his access revoked, and his surviving notes only survive thanks to an anonymous photocopy stored in a private collection in Bologna. But the notes are chilling. They mention a gospel where Christ speaks not just to men, but to the sun and the Nile, where his parables echo Osirian myths, where his crucifixion becomes part of a greater cycle: death, not as punishment, but as alignment. Imagine the implications. To the Church, such a text would have been heretical, at best blasphemous, at worst. To the Templars, it might have been revelation. A few dusty pages in a jar shouldn't change history. But this wasn't about history. It was about power. If a gospel could suggest that Egyptian cosmology and Christian theology weren't at odds but part of a unified continuum, it would mean the Templars had access to something Rome couldn't control, which might explain why they were in Memphis at all. Not to loot, not to build, but to listen, to dig, to study, and to disappear without a trace. And maybe that's why Blanchefort's patrol didn't return whole. Maybe they read the words aloud. Maybe they saw too much. Maybe they believed it. One surviving monk's record speaks of a ritual beneath the palm trees and a gospel read backward under eclipse. Another hints at a burial not of a man, but of a manuscript. Interred beneath limestone wrapped not in linen, but in lead leaf covered with carvings of both crucifix and ibis. Of course, no such artifact has been recovered. Not officially. But a private collector in Geneva once claimed possession of a page that glowed faintly under ultraviolet light. It bore no recognizable alphabet, just concentric circles punctuated by crosses at regular intervals. He called it the pulse of the sun. He died mysteriously 3 months later. Heart failure, they said. The page vanished. Even today, whispers persist. Of a gospel beneath the sands, of a scroll that sang under sunlight, of words that blurred the line between myth and Messiah. If the Templars found it, they didn't destroy it. They buried it, somewhere just beyond the reach of dogma, waiting perhaps for the next breath. They waited for the sun. Not any sun, not just any morning, but one precise alignment, one sacred moment when the light would cut a line through stone and shadow, marking a path only the initiated would recognize. Beneath the sand, beneath the towering presence of the Giza Plateau, whispers tell of a ritual known only to the highest ranks of the Knights Templar. A rite that didn't come from Jerusalem, but from the stars and the sun traced through ancient Egyptian temples and conducted in silence and secrecy. The account is pieced together from scattered fragments, some encoded in marginalia of confiscated Templar manuscripts, others hinted at in the personal diaries of European mystics centuries later. One text locked away in the Vatican's Archivum Secretum and described by a 19th-century defector priest speaks of a solar descent in which a chosen knight would enter the earth to stand in fire and awaken to stone. Another passage dated 1243 and attributed to a Templar named Geoffroy de Périgord references the pillar of light that opens only when Ra's eye falls in perfect line with the mother's tooth. Now, to most scribes and scholars, this would sound like poetic nonsense symbolism muddled by medieval minds trying to make sense of ruins and myth. But satellite imaging in the early 2000s identified a curious shaft misaligned from the main Giza complex by just a few degrees. The shaft runs deep, so deep in fact, that ground-penetrating radar could not determine its full depth due to interference. Its orientation aligned with the sun's zenith on the summer solstice. Precisely. According to the old writings, the ritual began days before the alignment. The chosen knight would fast. He would bathe in natron salt, not for cleanliness, but to unbind the shadow from the body, as one parchment phrases it. Then came the oil anointing with crushed lotus myrrh and cedar resin. Not biblical, Egyptian. Taken straight from mummification rites and the ceremonial preparation of priests in the temples of Heliopolis. Only the high commanders were permitted to witness what followed. The knight would descend into the shaft just before dawn. He carried no torch, only a single mirror-polished shield, curved to catch the incoming light. When the sun broke the horizon, its rays would travel down the passage, striking a mirrored slab set at a specific angle deep underground. If the knight positioned the shield correctly, the light would bounce from mirror to mirror, igniting the shaft in golden fire. A test not of strength, but alignment. Harmony with the cosmos. A communion between man and solar divinity. A strange coincidence, perhaps, but there's more. In 1817, British explorer Sir Benjamin Compton published a now obscure memoir about his Egyptian travels. He described entering a collapsed tunnel near Giza, guided by Bedouins who spoke of foreign priests of the cross who once lived inside the stone's eye. Deeper inside, Compton wrote of strange wall carvings, Templar crosses enclosed in solar discs, paired with inscriptions of Ra Horus and the sacred scarab. One phrase stood out: "He who walks in the sun's throat shall return seeing both worlds." Modern Egyptologists have debated these claims. Most dismiss the carvings as 18th-century forgeries or symbolic graffiti made by travelers with too much imagination. Yet in 1999, a French research team analyzing pigments from a similar Giza tunnel dated them to the 13th century, well within the Templar era. The deeper mystery lies in what the Templars were trying to achieve. This was no ordinary rite of passage. It wasn't about war or courage or loyalty. It was about revelation, transformation. There are scattered suggestions in the surviving Templar codices that those who completed the solar initiation were given access to a deeper layer of knowledge, a map perhaps, or a name. Something not to be recorded, only remembered. A recurring motif appears in multiple texts from the period: a knight emerging from darkness with golden eyes. Not literal gold, of course, probably symbolic of a spiritual awakening and enlightenment that marked him for the rest of his life. These men were never the same. Some returned to Europe and became silent advisors. Others vanished into desert hermitages. One reportedly entered a monastery in Mount Athos and never spoke another word. And then there's the story of Marcus de Valence, a name barely mentioned in most Templar rosters, except in a letter intercepted by Inquisition agents in 1305. The letter references Marcus, who bore the mark of Ra upon his chest and carried the sun's name in silence. When the Inquisition raided a Templar property in southern France the following year, they found a man matching that description. He refused to speak even under torture. Not a word. Only when the sun hit the high window of his cell did he finally look up and smile. It's tempting to dismiss these stories as mystic fantasy, but something clearly shifted in the inner ranks of the Templars after Egypt. A shift in symbols, in language, in doctrine. Their rituals became more solar, more geometrically aligned. They spoke less of crusades and more of light vision, the bridge between breath and flame, as though they'd undergone something they couldn't explain and didn't want to. The church grew increasingly nervous. Whispers of Egyptian rites, solar invocations, and hidden chambers deep beneath the sands began circulating among rival orders. It wasn't just heresy, they feared it was control slipping through their fingers. If the Templars had discovered a ritual that opened the mind, realigned the soul, or just maybe connected the initiate to something older and grander than the church itself, then Egypt wasn't just a detour. It was a portal. And like all portals, it required a key, one shaped by sunlight, silence, and stone. You would expect records. You would expect names. You would expect explanations. But what you find instead is silence, tight-lipped, deliberate, and unbroken. Entire Templar patrols that vanished in the Egyptian wilderness, only for fragments of them to reappear weeks or months later. Changed. Their reports were redacted, their accounts sealed, and in some cases they were never seen again. What happened in those stretches of desert that turned proud warriors into quiet shadows of themselves? The earliest tale is wrapped in contradiction. In the year 1216, during a lull between crusading campaigns, A Templar detachment was reportedly sent east from Cairo into the Sinai Peninsula. Officially, they were escorting supplies toward a monastery. Unofficially, they were tracking something far older, an artifact mentioned in an earlier cryptic letter by the Grand Preceptor of Provence. It spoke of a glass mirror buried where the moon dies and referenced a whispering circle of stone. Odd language for a military dispatch. The patrol never arrived. Days passed, then weeks. No bodies, no wreckage. The desert had consumed them. And then months later, 3 men returned. Starved, sunburnt, and with a 1,000-yard stare no confession could lift. They spoke only once to the Grand Master himself. No one else ever learned what was said. After that meeting, they were dispatched each to a different corner of Europe. One entered a secluded commandery in Portugal. Another was sent to the Scottish Highlands. The third was ordered into silence and took monastic vows beneath a new name. That wasn't an isolated case. In 1229, a small unit exploring near the ruins of ancient Tanis disappeared overnight from a well-guarded camp. Templar reinforcements searched for weeks and found nothing, no blood, no conflict, no scattered belongings. Only a single message carved into the inside of a limestone cave, half buried in wind-blown sand. He sees in shadow who walks without fear. Then came the most famous incident of all referenced obliquely in the trial records of Jacques de Molay. A caravan of Templar scholars had been en route from Alexandria, carrying a trove of strange scrolls, statues, and a locked copper crate that no one was allowed to touch. They were accompanied by 8 knights and 4 Coptic intermediaries. At some point deep in the western desert, the caravan split. Only the Copts and 1 knight returned. The rest, gone. The surviving knight, a man named Renaud de l'Aigle, refused to explain. In his eventual confession to Inquisition authorities recorded under duress, he simply repeated one phrase: "The desert judged us." That phrase appears again in a curious place etched in the corner of a Parisian codex, long forgotten until rediscovered in a private collection in 2004. The book, decorated with solar motifs and strange half-Coptic glyphs, contains a meditation on testing the soul against winds that speak and dunes that bury. Scholars have suggested it may be a poetic reflection on trial by ordeal. Others think it's a reference to a specific place, perhaps one tied to ancient Egyptian mystery schools. What unsettles modern historians is the consistency. Time and again, the pattern repeats. Patrols or small expeditions go out under vague orders, usually linked to forgotten ruins, lunar alignments, or buried knowledge. Some never return. Some return but are forever changed. And some are scrubbed entirely from the records, as if they never existed. Of course, skeptics say this is just the fog of war. Travel was perilous. The desert is cruel. Bandits, dehydration, misnavigation, all plausible causes. But then again, the desert doesn't typically spare a single survivor who returns with cryptic warnings and forbidden symbols carved into his flesh. Ah, yes, the carvings. An account from a French noble visiting Acre in 1274 mentions a Templar knight bearing a scarred cross upon his back, but with an eye at its center and lines of flame in place of arms. He was never introduced by name. He did not speak. He stayed for 1 night and then vanished, leaving only the impression that he had seen something that no man was meant to see. A similar symbol, a cross intersected by a sun disk, and what appears to be a stylized ankh, was recently found in a collapsed passage near Dashur. Dated tentatively to the 13th century, it matches no known Islamic or Coptic iconography. But it does resemble a sketch found in a marginal note by Nicolas Flamel, who, if earlier suspicions are correct, may have received knowledge trickling down from these very Templar desert journeys. The question is, What could leave grown men, trained warriors, so completely altered? Some theories suggest that deep desert exposure triggered hallucinations, especially when combined with fasting or ceremonial practices. Others believe they were experimenting with ancient rites that had once belonged to Egyptian priesthoods and were dangerously incomplete or misunderstood by their European inheritors. Or maybe they found something, a structure, a vault, a presence. Earlier we mentioned the solar initiation rite. What if these disappearances weren't unintended losses but attempts to replicate or expand on it? What if deeper in the desert, far from any watchful eye, they were testing the limits of the ritual's power? Even modern archaeologists have stumbled across inexplicable features, straight-line depressions in the rock too precise to be natural, yet too remote to serve any known function. Shallow steps carved into the stone that led nowhere, chambers beneath bedrock sealed with alloys no one used at the time. One such location, documented only briefly in the expedition logs of a 1930s British team, described a narrow shaft capped by a stone slab etched with what they called Coptic Christian alchemy. They didn't get far. A sandstorm buried the site within a day. Locals called it the Well of the Silent Men. The Templars, it seems, knew about that place, and they kept going back. Because whatever they found, whatever truth they glimpsed in those star-burned nights and sun-scorched plains, was not something they could leave behind. It pulled at them, changed them, demanded their silence or their lives. Some never spoke again. Some whispered to walls no one else could see, and some just walked into the dunes and never returned. There's something eerie about finding symbols where they shouldn't be. Something unsettling about discovering that two entirely different civilizations, separated by oceans, cultures, and millennia, carved the same shapes into stone with the same reverent care. You've seen the cross of the Knights Templar, red and defiant, stitched into their mantles and carved into battle-worn shields. But what happens when that symbol begins to blur, when the cross gains a loop, when it begins to resemble not the weapon of sacrifice, but the key of life? It started quietly, not with some dramatic unveiling or long-lost scroll, just a codex, a fragile volume housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, long miscatalogued as devotional poetry. It wasn't poetry. It was a visual manuscript, a meditative set of diagrams tracing spiritual concepts across geometry. Within its faded pages, scholars found a recurring motif, a cruciform shape unmistakably Christian, yet at its center bloomed the unmistakable loop of an Egyptian ankh. You could call it artistic whimsy. But then the pattern repeated. A wall fragment from a ruined Templar chapel near Marseille showed a near-identical carving. Red ochre paint clung to the grooves, weather-worn but clear. Again the loop. Not just a T-shaped cross, but an ankh stylized merged with Templar lines. The French ministry brushed it off as misinterpretation. But independent researchers traced similar symbols to over a dozen sites. Templar commanderies in Spain, underground chapels in Portugal, stonework beneath former Crusader fortresses in Cyprus. Of course you remember the glyph from Dashur, the scarred symbol found etched into a collapsed tunnel wall. Its proportions weren't purely Egyptian nor wholly medieval. It was a hybrid. The vertical line of the cross extended too far, the loop too wide, but within that distortion was intent. Someone was fusing ideologies. The ankh in Egyptian cosmology represented life, eternal, spiritual, and cyclical. It was more than a symbol. It was a metaphysical key. Pharaohs held it before their lips in tomb paintings to breathe eternity. Gods extended it toward mortals as a blessing. The cross, by contrast, carried death, but a redemptive one. Together, the loop and the blade might suggest something deeper: death as the passage to true life, and life as a cycle preserved only through sacred knowledge. Now consider this. In 1306, a Templar preceptor named Alain de Montségur was arrested under suspicion of heretical teachings. His confession, extracted under duress yet oddly specific, claimed that he had been shown a scroll of signs, written in a language older than Latin and shaped like birds and sickles. He said the scroll taught of a womb beneath the stone, and a god whose eye saw both soul and bone. What caught inquisitors' attention, however, was his sketch: a cross encircled by rays, with an elongated loop crowning its top. This, he said, was the true sign. The Vatican burned that page, or tried to. But a copy surfaced in a Jesuit archive in the 1700s. A theologian named Franciscus Calamont reviewed it and scrawled in the margins, "He is confusing Horus with Christ." That marginalia proved revealing, because the connections between Horus, the falcon-headed god of vision, healing, and rebirth, and Christian symbolism are more tangled than you'd expect. Horus's right eye represented the sun, his left the moon. When Set destroyed one, Thoth restored it, giving rise to the eye of Horus, the Wedjat, a symbol of regeneration. Now look again at medieval depictions of Christ Pantocrator, the halo behind his head, the eyes disproportionately large, the posture of blessing with the right hand lifted. In some illuminated manuscripts, the resemblance borders on uncanny. What if the Templars weren't just adopting symbols for aesthetics? What if they believed the Ankh and the cross represented two halves of a greater truth? Earlier, you followed the caravan that vanished into the desert carrying sealed crates and cryptic scrolls. One of the recovered scroll fragments, allegedly acquired through Coptic intermediaries, mentioned the Shepherd of the Boundary, a title later echoed in Merovingian myths and early Gnostic texts. Some scholars argue that this shepherd was a synthesis, a messiah figure, drawn from both Egyptian and early Christian traditions, one who opened not just tombs, but memory. You'll recall the scar-marked Templar from Acre, the one who bore a cross with an eye at its center and lines like flame. That symbol appears again in a stone lintel recovered from a submerged chapel in the Nile Delta. Local lore called it the Key of the Dead, and it was believed to unlock visions not of the afterlife, but of lives already lived, forgotten, and buried. Which brings us to the suppressed Parisian codices compiled by a dissident Dominican friar who traveled extensively through the Levant. One entry speaks of Knights of the Loop Cross, who walked backward through the dark to read what time had sealed. He describes rituals involving mirror-lit chambers and whispered prayers in a language older than Greek. He claims they sought to undo the fall of Babel not through conquest, but through symbol, a convergence of divine scripts. Did the Templars believe they had found the original language of creation, that in merging the Ankh and the cross, they were restoring something lost in the flood of dogma? A papal bull from Clement V in 1307 warns of foreign signs corrupting the true path. He accuses unnamed knights of replacing the cross of Christ with shapes of Egyptian sorcery. No one took it seriously. But the language lingers. Egypt was never just a backdrop for the Templars. It was a mirror, a cradle of metaphysical architecture, a place where gods walked and symbols lived. The Templars saw in the Ankh not blasphemy, but blueprint, and so they carved it. Not everywhere. Just in places they knew wouldn't be found. Beneath altars, inside tombs, etched faintly on the undersides of shields. Because what they were building wasn't just a military order. It was a library made of stone and silence. You've followed this thread from Cairo to the caves, from codices to crosses, from the blood-soaked sands to the quiet symbols no one was supposed to understand. But now you've seen it too. And once you see the loop on the cross, you start seeing it everywhere. You've likely heard whispers of alchemy, the ancient art of transformation, where lead becomes gold and death gives way to immortality. But the popular image of bearded men stirring cauldrons and muttering Latin incantations is frankly a distraction. The deeper layers of alchemy, those the Templars became entangled in, were never about base metals. They were about the soul, and Egypt, with its obsession for eternity and ritual preservation, had already mastered that long before the word alchemist ever reached Europe. Let's begin not in a smoky laboratory, but in a burial shaft outside of Saqqara. When French archaeologist Claude Dufresne stumbled upon the tomb in 1892, he noted something strange. Amid the familiar funerary texts and iconography, one panel had been painted over, and beneath the faded plaster, they discovered something odd, an image of a man seated between two flasks, one gold, one black. Over his head hovered the Eye of Horus, and in his lap sat a book with a cross etched into its cover. Dufresne thought it a late-period forgery, but the pigment dated back to the 12th century. The 12th century, Crusader era, and the book in the painting. It bore an uncanny resemblance to the leather-bound Resurrectio manuscript, unearthed from beneath the ruins of a former Templar outpost near Damietta. That manuscript was never meant for eyes outside the order. Yet in the brief window before the Vatican sealed it away, a handful of scholars reviewed its contents. Their consensus, a bizarre synthesis of Coptic funerary rites, Hermetic invocations, and strangely modern theories about spirit replication and celestial mirrors. You've encountered bits of this before. Remember the scroll Nicholas Flamel allegedly translated, the one rumored to contain the secret to eternal life. It too described something resembling the eye ritual, a process by which the initiate unseals the eye within aligning their soul with a higher realm, not through prayer, but through precise meditative geometry and exposure to mirrored surfaces angled with the rising sun. The language is poetic, of course, but the recurrence of mirrored light cross-shaped diagrams and ritual sleep states, it all echoes earlier Egyptian ceremonies. The Templars weren't just borrowing Egyptian symbols. They were reenacting their sacred processes reforged with Christian overlays. One entry from the manuscript describes the first death, a state induced by fasting, sensory deprivation, and chanting. The initiate would lie beneath a cross-marked canopy. At the precise moment of solar culmination, he was to be awakened and shown the eye. If he did not shatter, he could proceed. If he did, well, there were no instructions for that. What's more unsettling is that these rituals seem to have persisted underground long after the Templars fell. In 1684, a Jesuit chronicler in Venice recorded the activities of a secretive brotherhood calling themselves the Sons of the Dawn. He claimed they practiced a resurrection rite drawn from desert-born scripture and made reference to the sacred eye that sleeps in fire. There's even speculation that this group had access to a set of Templar scrolls smuggled out of Egypt through Alexandria, then quietly funneled into Europe via merchant libraries, posing as legitimate theological institutions. Some of the scrolls contain diagrams of human anatomy overlaid with strange star charts. One depicted the soul as a six-fold spiral ascending through geometric gates, each labeled with a composite glyph of the ankh and cross. But what did they believe the Eye of Horus actually was? Here's where things veer into the speculative, but not ungrounded. Ancient Egyptians believed the Eye of Horus held healing power, yes, but also the ability to perceive hidden truths. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a model of consciousness. 6 parts each corresponding to a different human sense: sight, hearing, thought, smell, taste, and touch. The full eye represented total awareness, unity of body and spirit. Now consider Templar confessions under torture, often dismissed as coerced babble, yet strangely consistent in theme. Many spoke of the gaze or the eye that watches even in sleep. Some described it as golden. Others said it bled light. One cryptically said it saw behind the veil and demanded we do the same. Notably, these confessions appeared not only in France but in Germany, Cyprus, and even England, regions far removed from one another, yet echoing the same symbolic core. More intriguing still is the rumored alchemical process, allegedly practiced by a few high-ranking Templars, blending Coptic embalming techniques with elements from the corpus hermeticum. They called it the division, wherein the soul was intentionally split into mirrored aspects, one to remain in the body, the other to journey. Upon return, the initiate would claim to have seen the stars inside the stone. It's poetic madness. But also familiar, isn't it, a callback to that chamber beneath Giza, where light danced on salt crystal walls and knights returned unable or unwilling to speak. You followed their trail across continents. But now it begins to spiral inward, into dreams, into metaphysics, into something the Templars believed had to be kept silent, not because it was dangerous in the usual sense, but because it was true in ways that could not be explained. They weren't building immortality machines. They were building thresholds. Which brings you back to the eye. That ubiquitous glyph half-closed, haloed, always watching. The Egyptians called it Ujjat. The Templars called it the flame of return. Modern scholars dismiss both as symbols. But what if it wasn't merely an icon, what if it was a blueprint for resurrection? Through memory. And if so, whose memory have we been walking through? The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the last breath of Christian control in the Holy Land. A collapse so total, so abrupt, that even seasoned chroniclers described it as if the world had tilted. But before the walls crumbled and the Templar stronghold by the sea was drowned in blood and ash, something moved quietly in the desert, something wrapped in silence and locked within sealed chests borne not on banners but on wheels, the last caravan. It departed from an unnamed point somewhere near the Fayum Basin in Egypt, according to a single surviving entry in a Genoese merchant's log. He didn't call it a caravan. He called it a procession of white ghosts riding under the moon, trailed by mules and covered wagons. 4 guards led 12 followed behind, all armed but unmarked. They didn't stop to trade. They didn't speak. But they were seen crossing the Sinai with remarkable speed, too fast, some claimed, for ordinary travelers. Why does this matter? Because 2 weeks later, Acre fell, and the names of every Templar recorded as part of that caravan vanished from the rolls. We're not talking about battlefield deaths. These were high-ranking logisticians, scribes, quartermasters, the backbone of a coordinated retreat or preservation mission. And yet after their entry in a minor harbor ledger, there's nothing. No arrival at Acre, no exit, no execution lists, just disappearance. The implication has haunted historians ever since, because sealed chests were mentioned not once but thrice by different observers along the route. A monk at the monastery of St. Catherine wrote in his margin notes about a group of foreign knights carrying coffers bound with black iron who refused the blessing of the abbot and left before dawn. A soldier in Gaza claimed he saw golden latticework glinting through a torn tarp, and a young scribe from Ascalon scribbled that he saw one of the mules collapse, spilling its burden, a wrapped bundle that looked, in his words, not unlike a child, yet stiff as carved wood. That scribe's notes were preserved only because they were copied into a broader regional report. But taken together, these accounts form a peculiar picture, a Templar extraction disguised as retreat, moving something sacred or dangerous out of Egypt just before the order's collapse in the east. Now remember the chamber beneath the Sphinx whispered about in earlier reports. Remember the sealed scrolls in Flamel's vault, the mirrored rites, the Ankh cross diagrams, the gospel buried near Memphis. None of these were random. They were part of a puzzle the Templars believed they had to solve and safeguard. And if their Egyptian revelations were indeed that world-shaking, would they have left them to burn in Acre? According to one theory proposed by a Jesuit antiquarian in the 17th century, the caravan didn't go to Acre to defend it. It went there as a decoy. The real contents, texts, relics, objects never described in detail may have been diverted north toward Antioch, or even west to the coastlines near Tripoli. Some suggest they were loaded onto a ship called the Sanctum Lux, which was recorded leaving harbor 2 days before the fall, bound for Cyprus. But others point to an even more cryptic possibility that the chests never left Egypt at all. You see, certain Coptic sources hint at a monastery not marked on any Western maps, an ancient structure half swallowed by desert winds, known only in oral tradition as the house without windows. This place, they say, had a vault beneath the altar, reachable only by reciting a prayer in a dialect now extinct. And more interesting still, some say it was built by a Coptic Templar alliance during the waning years of the Crusades, designed to hold a memory too vast for parchment and too sacred for the Church. That phrase, too vast for parchment, keeps surfacing in manuscripts tied to the final Templar years, not just in Egypt, but in France and Aragon. It seems to describe something that cannot be written down. A vision, an experience, a proof of concept, perhaps, that resurrection of the soul, the self, or even history was not fantasy, but something once witnessed. Something worth hiding. Why would the Templars go to such lengths? Why cloak their final movements in secrecy even from their own allies? Perhaps because what they carried challenged not just papal authority, but the very narrative of divine hierarchy. If Egyptian cosmology and Christian mysticism shared a root, if alchemy, resurrection, and the Eye of Horus revealed a deeper unity of faiths, then everything the Church sought to control would become negotiable. But we can't know for certain. All we have are scattered pieces, faded sigils, vanishing names. Still, the path is clear enough to follow. The Templars didn't just flee Egypt. They exfiltrated something. Whether it was knowledge, relics, or memory, they believed it was worth dying for, or disappearing for. So the next time someone says Acre was the end of the Crusader dream, remind them of the caravan no one saw arrive, the sealed chests no one ever opened, and the maps that no longer show where they were going. Because maybe they weren't fleeing defeat. Maybe they were finishing a mission. You arrive at the end of a long corridor carved not from stone, but from centuries of silence. It leads not to a door, but to a question. What if the treasure buried beneath the Temple Mount wasn't just what the Templars were seeking, but also what they had already found somewhere else beneath the pyramids, beneath the sand, beneath history itself? The Temple Mount has long been the gravitational center of Templar lore. From their earliest days in Jerusalem, the order established its headquarters on that sacred plateau, supposedly atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. For generations, whispers surrounded their time there of deep excavations, of midnight digging, of scrolls unearthed, and secrets ferried away under cover of prayer. And yet, despite centuries of obsession, nothing definitive has ever been pulled from the earth there. The deeper you dig, the more it seems the treasure was never there to begin with. But here's the twist. According to a set of cryptic marginalia found in a 14th century French Bible, now housed in a dusty archive in Avignon, a group of Templar leaders long after the fall of Jerusalem returned to the Temple Mount under false identities. Not to search, but to rebury. The text, written in a nervous, jagged hand, refers to fratres albi de Egypto, white brothers from Egypt, arriving in Jerusalem during a truce period, escorted by local monks and disguised as merchants. They carried 3 lead-sealed boxes and a long copper rod, etched with markings neither Greek nor Latin, but like the curved script of the southern sands. The note concludes with a phrase that defies clear translation. They brought the voice back to where the silence began. Could it be that the Templars uncovered something beneath the pyramids, something they could not keep in Europe, something too incendiary even for their secretive order? If so, then returning it to Jerusalem, into the very heart of Abrahamic sanctity, would have symbolic power. A loop closed, a secret hidden in the place where myth and monotheism first collided. Of course, the modern Temple Mount is no easy place to investigate. Politics, religion, and armed guards keep shovels far from sacred soil. But early 20th century British engineers tasked with subterranean mapping left behind incomplete diagrams showing voids and channels beneath the Haram al-Sharif, some of which remain unaccounted for. One in particular runs directly beneath the supposed site of the Holy of Holies, and one chamber noted only as unreachable cavity 3B was described as containing a curious resonance, as if it answered back. That same resonance was described by Templar chroniclers centuries before. When they spoke of vaults that hum and echoes not born from sound, they were likely referring to the same acoustic anomalies. If the copper rod carried from Egypt was designed to respond to such resonance, perhaps as part of a ritual or a key, the implications are staggering. Rewind a moment. Recall the gospel fragment reportedly found in the sands of Memphis. Recall the solar shaft beneath Giza aligned to the equinox. Recall the final caravan, its chests never opened. What if the point of all this wasn't just to gather knowledge, but to seal it again, to bury it not in desert, but in doctrine? By bringing Egyptian revelations back to Jerusalem, the Templars may have attempted a theological fusion, a rewriting of origins. In one radical theory circulated among fringe scholars in the 1700s, the Temple Mount became a metaphysical lockbox, not just for relics, but for a concept. A concept that unified the cyclical death-rebirth of Osiris with the singular resurrection of Christ. A concept that made Jesus not the end of prophecy, but the continuation of a much older ritual lineage. This would explain the fury of the Church, not merely scandalized by wealth or independence, but horrified by what the Templars believed. That the cross and the Ankh were not rivals, but reflections. That Egypt was not pagan error, but primordial preparation. And so the burial beneath the mount becomes more than a symbolic act. It becomes a safeguard, not against discovery, but against misuse. Because whatever the Templars unearthed beneath the pyramids, be it text, artifact, or revelation, they believed its power was real. Not metaphorical, not poetic. Real enough to change the course of kingdoms. Real enough to die for. The last hint comes from a monk's dream journal written at Montségur shortly before its fall. He recounts a vision of a staircase descending into the earth beneath a dome of stars, ending at a door with no handle. The door opens not to light, but to music without source. And behind it, a stone altar, and above it the shape of a cross, elongated into an ankh. You might say it's all allegory, dreams and dust. But remember how far we've come. Cairo, Giza, the Serapeum, the library, the caravan, the mount. Each piece laid in sequence, not by coincidence, but by design. And maybe that design always pointed back to the one place no one dares to dig. Because sometimes, to hide a truth, you don't bury it where no one will look. You bury it where everyone looks, but no one sees. So here we are, 23 steps into a labyrinth of dust, blood symbols, and silence. And now at last, the torchlight catches the final wall. You've traced the Templars across deserts and libraries, beneath obelisks and church domes, through forbidden rituals and unanswered prayers. And now it's time to ask, not what they searched for, but what they found. Because every sign, every anomaly, every fragment points to one conclusion: beneath the pyramids, the Templars encountered something that wasn't just ancient, it was alive in meaning. Not a relic, a revelation. Start with the facts. The Order's earliest missions pushed beyond Palestine into territories not aligned with their crusading goals. Egypt, though hostile, became a repeated destination. These journeys made no military sense, but they made perfect sense for something else: retrieval. Acquisition, exchange. Then came the anomalies. Templar fortifications echoing Egyptian geometry, scrolls turning up in Paris with scripts no European scholar could name, graffiti hidden within pyramids that matched knightly cross insignias. The deeper you look, the more the connective tissue appears, threading from Giza to Jerusalem to Acre, and then dissolving into the sea spray of history. And what was at the center of it all? Not gold, not weapons, but knowledge. Knowledge that merged Egyptian and Christian cosmologies. Texts that reframed resurrection as transmutation, soul-splitting as sacrament. A gospel that cast Jesus not as a disruptor of old faiths, but as their embodiment. A solar rite that didn't just honor a god, but timed itself to a celestial event, matching rituals long lost in both Rome and Memphis. And a map that showed the very bowels of the Giza Plateau, decades before modern archaeology confirmed such tunnels even existed. These were not coincidences, they were convergences. So what was this revelation? It was that history, your history, their history. Our history is not a line, it's a spiral. That the myths of Osiris, the rites of Horus, the Ankh's loop, and the cross's beam were all part of a single, unbroken continuum. That what the church branded as heresy might have been older than the church itself. That beneath the dogma, beneath the marble, beneath the silence, something still breathes. And the Templars, those pale riders in red crosses, didn't just stumble into this knowledge. They chose it. They studied it. And in the end, they sealed it not to protect themselves, but to protect the world from what it wasn't ready to understand. Because power once revealed can't be put back. Their final act was not to hoard it. It was to hide it. In chests never opened. In gospels never canonized. In vaults never mapped. In mounts never excavated. In silence. And if you ask why it matters now after so many centuries, after so much forgetting, it's because that silence is thinning. Bit by bit, word by word. The stories that were once dismissed as fantasy are aligning with science. Tunnels once called myths are now being scanned. Rituals long buried are being mirrored in quantum dreams and neural nets and linguistic echoes no one can quite explain. The past is catching up, and the real secret isn't what they found beneath the pyramids. It's why they buried it again. Let your eyes grow heavy now. The fire has burned low, the echoes have faded, and the sands have covered our tracks. There's no need to chase further because the ones who walked before us have already turned back. Whatever they found, whatever was unearthed in the hollow under stone and star, it now belongs to the silence. You've wandered a long road tonight. Through corridors carved in limestone beneath flags of red and white into whispers, folded within scrolls that crumble at the touch. You've stood beside men who vanished without explanation, and knelt where hieroglyphs once wept under moonlight. You've listened for chants in forgotten dialects, and traced the Ankh's curve where the cross once stood. And now you've come to the end, not with certainty, but with something stranger, stillness. What lies beneath the pyramids may never be spoken plainly, not in any language we still know. The Templars didn't just bury relics. They buried a mirror, one that reflected something older than empire, older than church, older even than death. So let that mystery rest now deep in the dark where the sun does not reach. Let it pulse in silence untouched by archaeologists' tools or theologians' pens. Let it breathe only when the wind moves just right across the desert floor. The kind of wind that rustles linen in catacombs. The kind that carries dreams shaped like keys. The stones are still there, of course. They always are. Heavy, watching, waiting. And beneath them the answer curls in shadow, not to be solved but to be dreamt. Sleep now, in the hush of the ancient, in the shadow of the stones, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, where secrets do not fade, they only whisper.